Okay, and I'm not going to do.
Sorry about that. I forgot to start that at the beginning of the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to go into presentation mode because I'm going to like point at things, and y'all see my cursor moving around too, so I can point at things.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so this presentation is about the history, exploration, and conservation of Fern Cave. And since there's some newer cavers here, Fern Cave is in Jackson County, Alabama, sort of in between Huntsville and Scottsboro, kind of near Stevens Gap, where a couple of you just went. So this is, I'm kind of a giant history nerd. That's why I wrote a book about this cave. So there's going to be a lot of historic photos and stuff like that. So go ahead and get started. Okay, so just a little bit of background. Like I said, Fern Cave is in Alabama, and it's the longest cave in Alabama. It's almost 16 miles long, and it has the deepest pit in Alabama and one of the deepest caves in the country. Surprise Pit is 437 feet deep. It's also one of the most biologically significant caves in the country. It has all kinds of crazy archaeology and paleontology in it that I find really fascinating. And it has 5 entrances. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service owns 4, and the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, the same group that owns Stevens Gap, they own 1 also. And this is like my favorite cave ever. It's beautiful, it's fun, it's challenging, it has a little bit of everything. So just to orient you a little bit, if you're not really familiar with Fern Cave, so this is Highway 72 that runs between Scottsboro and Huntsville. Fern Cave is located here. Kennemer Cave is about here, if you know where that is, and Stevens Gap and Limrock are kind of up in the, not too far from that. And of course, here's a very important landmark of Joe's Pizza. New cavers stop there. They have great pizza after cave trips. So here is a very, you probably can't really see this very well on Zoom, but this is kind of a small map of Fern Cave. And it's really the Fern Cave system. It was originally 4 different caves that were connected in the 1970s. And a lot of you have probably been to Surprise Pit or know what that is. So Fern Cave is the Surprise Pit area, and that was the first area that was discovered. The entrance to that cave is right here. Surprise Pit is right there. The second cave that was discovered is the Morgue Complex. This is where the bats hibernate. We'll talk about the bats in a while. That's over here. New Fern is the section of the cave with the Johnston entrance, and I'll describe what that is in a little bit, but that entrance is here, and that's how you access the vast majority of the rest of this cave. And there's also an entrance that isn't on this map, kind of runs off the edge. It's down near the Paint Rock River, and it also connects. So this cave system, it's over 450 feet in vertical extent. Like I said, it has 5 entrances and it has 18 distinct levels. So this is a profile view of some of the cave. This is not the entire cave. This is part of a remapping effort that I'll also talk about in a little bit, but this is maybe about 10 miles of the cave. And you can just see where the different entrances are, and you can just see how complicated it is. There's a bunch of sections like in here and here that haven't been mapped. None of this area has really been mapped, but I kind of like the profile view because it really gives you a good perspective of the cave. So now I just want to show you a couple pictures of Fern to give you an idea of what it's like. There are a couple photographers who have done some recent work in Fern that I'll show you. It has some of the most spectacular formations you will see anywhere. This is part of a helictite room, which is just absolutely spectacular. Nice formation area. Has lots of domes and pits and all kinds of great formations in them. Just for some perspective, you can see a little tiny person right there. A lot of the cave in the upper levels is really complicated canyon passage, and you can just see what some of the typical passage looks like. And that's me and my husband, Steve, in one of the main thoroughfares in the cave. Lots of big rooms. These are some photos by J.B. Van Sweringen. He was a prolific photographer of the cave back in the 80s and 90s. This is one of the entrances. This is actually one of DCG's former members in one of the major formation rooms. There's all kinds of interesting leads that people have explored in the cave. A lot of them are very difficult to get to. And some of you probably know Avis Van Sweringen. This is a nice picture of her. So now I wanted to get into a little bit of the history of the cave. And these are three of the people who were really important in some of the early exploration. Bill Terode, he's a Huntsville caver. Well, they're all Huntsville cavers, but it's Bill Terode, Dick Graham, and Jim Johnston. And one of the things for those of you who are vertical cavers, I wanted to call your attention to these rappel devices. These are photos from when vertical caving was still being developed. So people were just experimenting with all kinds of crazy things. I don't even know what this is. But if you look at Jim's rappel device, he was using some carabiners with brake bars in between them as his rappel device. This was before racks were available. So the first entrance to Fern Cave was discovered June 4th, 1961. And the Huntsville Grotto decided to go on a grotto trip. And Bill Terode, whom a lot of you know, he's just legendary in the caving community. At the time, he was 17 years old, and he had heard of a big pit entrance up on Nat Mountain in Jackson County, and he talked the grotto into going up there. So they went up there and they found this gorgeous sinkhole that had two different entrances. And when they went into this cave and they threw some rocks into the pit they found, it took like 6 seconds for the rocks to hit the bottom. So they knew they had a really, really deep pit. And like I said, this was 1961. Vertical caving was brand new. Most people at that time actually used cable ladders to explore vertical caves. That was really the best technique people had. Like even a 200-foot pit, I've been told people would use a cable ladder and they would just tie a safety rope to them and go up and down the rope. So Huntsville Grotto definitely did not have the equipment to explore the cave on their own. So they contacted this fellow named Bill Cuddington. He lived in Virginia at the time, and he's considered the father of vertical caving. He was experimenting with a lot of techniques that are now called single rope technique, where you would go up and down one rope using Prusik knots as your ascenders. And this was actually really controversial at the time, but he was doing a lot of experimenting and trying to figure out the best and safest ways to go up and down ropes. So he had some really long ropes and some vertical gear, and he was the one that had the experience to explore this really deep cave. This is a picture of a guy going into Fern in the late 60s, and you can just see how different their rope looks from the rope we use now. This rope was very flexible, and it was a lot different from like the PMI pit rope we use now. It really absorbed a lot of water for one thing. So after people were, after you put your rope in the pit, the rope would get really, really heavy. So that's a big difference between then and now. These are just some pictures of some people exploring the cave in the 60s. And you can also see how different the clothing and the gear they used were. Of course, you couldn't just go down to Target or Walmart or REI and get anything. You had to really hunt around for gear. So people did a lot of shopping at Army surplus stores. You can see that this bag is probably Army surplus. People wore jeans jacket and blue jeans and flannel shirts a lot when they were caving, because that's what you could find. Now, I forgot to ask before I started, I don't know if I can even see this, but how many people have been to Surprise Pit? I'm just kind of curious. Okay. So.
Ollie and Dan, yes.
Okay. So I wanted to show you a series of pictures to show you what getting to the pit was like in the 60s, and then we'll see what it's like now. So back in the 1960s, what you did, you went into the cave and you popped out of this canyon right here. And this is basically Surprise Pit. It's 400 feet from here down to the bottom. So you had to climb down in this giant wide canyon, sit over here, then you kind of had to like step across over to here. And this picture over here just shows a guy doing the same thing with a little more safety equipment. Then once you got down on this ledge, you kind of had to skirt around this giant boulder. And this was the rig point right here. And just a side note, when Bill Terode was in there messing around in the late 60s, and everybody hated this rock, you know, because you had to kind of cling to it and kind of inch around it. It was a big hassle. So Bill went in and kind of was looking at it, and he kind of shoved on it a little bit. He said that rock just fell right into the pit. So the rock is not there anymore. And Bill said Bill told me that people's hair would have turned gray if they would have known how easy it was to push that rock in the pit. These are just a couple more pictures of the rope and the rigging people use. This was a safety line. This wasn't the rigging line, but that's just a good close-up of the rope that was used then. Also, you couldn't get just a seat harness at the store or whatever. So people would tie up a seat harness just with webbing. And this is the rappel device that Bill Cuddington was using at the time. It's called a rappel spool. And it used the same concept of friction that the rack uses, except you would just wrap the rope around this thing and then attach it to your seat harness. So that's what the rappel device looked like. And they climbed out, instead of using mechanical ascenders like we mostly use now, they use 3 Prusik knots. You would attach 1 Prusik knot to either your seat harness or a chest harness, and then you had to have 2 of these on your feet. And then you would just sort of like do a sit and stand type of thing to get up out of the pit. And so Bill came up, he had 2 ropes that he tied together, put them in the pit. This is what Surprise Pit, this is a modern picture of Surprise. It's really spectacular. So the first time Bill rappelled into the pit, he went down to the knot, which was about 60 feet off the floor. And he managed to get his spool off the rope, and he was just sort of dangling there with his Prusik knots. And he could not get his spool back on the rope to get down to the bottom of the pit. So what he ended up doing was he wrapped the rope around his body, and he body rappelled the last 60 feet to the bottom of the pit, which I think is just crazy. So that's the story of the very first person who went down to the bottom of Surprise Pit. Okay, so now the Huntsville Grotto, who discovered this cave, they really wanted to do the pit too. So Bill Cuddington let them borrow the rope, and they went a couple weeks later. Now, the grotto, nobody in the grotto had a rappel device like the spool, but they did have this crazy thing called a rappel hammer. And this is what it looked like. You would just wrap the rope around the top of this hammer, and like, you new people, do not do this. Do not use this. There's no way that I would ever use this. So, and they had one of them. They had a community rappel device. So 2 guys from the grotto that day rappelled. The first guy went down, then they tied the hammer to the end of the rope. They pulled it up. And this second guy named Billy Garrison, he went down second. So there were 2 people from the Huntsville Grotto that went down that day. And this is, I think, the first photo ever taken of a person in Surprise Pit. And this is one of the earliest photos of Surprise. I just really like this perspective. I think it's really pretty. Okay, so after people started going to the pit, at the rig point, if you looked down the ledge, you could see that the ledge still continued, but there was this really huge gap in the ledge that was about 4 feet wide, and nobody wanted to go across it. Finally, one guy got up the nerve and did the step across and managed to find the rig point that we use today. And they ended up rigging the safety line so people could kind of semi-safely maneuver that. And past that step across, they reached the rig point that we use today. And this is the breakdown bridge. And this is a nice perspective because you can see that this place where we rigged the rope now is just a bunch of rocks kind of wedged in this canyon. And this is above the 400-foot Surprise Pit there. This is one of the very earliest maps of the cave, and I just think this is kind of cool because it was obviously made out of construction paper or something, but you can see this is the scary canyon. This is the rock that Bill pushed into the pit, the original rig point, the scary step across, And this is where the rig point is now. And this map is not super accurate, but it actually gives you a pretty good representation of what the pit looks like. Okay, so that was all pretty scary. If that was the way you had to get to the pit today, there's a pretty high chance that I would never have gone there because I don't like, exposure and that kind of stuff. So, and a lot of people in the grotto started to worry that with the increasing visitation to the cave, somebody would get hurt. And in fact, one woman did have a pretty severe accident in the early 60s. She lost control during her rappel and she broke her back. Luckily, she managed to climb out of the pit on her own, so she did not require a rescue. But people were really worried about, what if somebody gets hurt? It would be really, really difficult to get somebody out. So Bill Turow decided to fix this problem. And what he did is he went in there and he dug this ledge out by hand. And you can see it's a nice wide ledge, pretty tall. It has a lot nice height there. And he figured that would solve the problem. The funny thing is, cavers around the country lost their minds about this. They were just like, oh my God, I can't believe that Bill, he changed the natural cave. He made the cave too easy. This is just horrible. It was a huge controversy. But the funny thing is, everybody used that ledge. People love the ledge and they still use the ledge to this day. So that's just a funny story about the route to Surprise Pit. Okay, so for a number of years, that was all Fern Cave was. It was just a fairly short cave with a really big pit in it. And people knew that there were probably other caves in that area. Keep in mind, the Alabama cave survey number for Fern is 597. So when they found this cave, there really weren't very many caves known in Alabama, less than 600. So people were finding stuff all the time. And the second entrance that cavers discovered was called the Morgue in 1968. And actually, some Huntsville cavers were actually looking for Kennemer Cave, and they got off on the wrong direction and they found this cave. And they called some people from the Huntsville Grotto, said they found this giant pit, they think it's another surprise pit. It's probably 600 feet deep. So we went up and took a look at it. Here's another perspective of the pit entrance. It's really pretty. You rappel down about 60 feet or so to the bottom of the sinkhole, and there's two very obvious canyons going off from the bottom of the sinkhole. There's this one huge canyon, and you can see a person here for scale to see how big it is. On the other side of the sinkhole is another canyon, and when the cavers first went up there to check it out, they threw a rock into this one, and it just seemed to it wasn't a pit, so they weren't interested in that. And they threw a rock in this one, and it seemed like a pit, so they decided to go ahead and rig it. And when they rigged it, this is the rig point for the morgue entrance. You kind of creep along this ledge. There's some bolts there now, and you rappel off the side. And it's a pretty nice 90-foot pit. But when they got to the bottom of the pit, there was a dead skunk down there, a bunch of other dead animals, and it just smelled really bad in there. So they named it the Morgue. And shortly thereafter, they found another entrance to this section of the cave called the Little Morgue. And that entrance is also pretty small and kind of nasty, has a lot of guano in it. But the pit to get down into that entrance is really beautiful. This is what it looks like. So when they kind of started looking around in the morgue, it was a very complicated complex of canyons, some big rooms, domes, that kind of thing. But they noticed everything was covered in guano. All this black that you see, that is bat droppings. And it was really slippery. It didn't smell good. So people weren't very inspired to continue doing a big mapping project in this cave. So they kind of looked around, made note of it, and they kind of forgot about it. Then about 6 months after they discovered the morgue, Bill Turow and this fellow named Jim Johnston here were ridge walking off to the northwest of Fern Cave, and they found this other entrance. You can see this tiny little hole there. That's the entrance that they discovered. And when they went into this cave, they found huge walking passage, big rooms, lots of canyons, and it was trending directly towards Surprise Pit. And they got super excited because they figured any second they were going to pop out on the other side of Surprise. Well, that didn't happen, but they found a very large, beautiful cave very close to Surprise, and they were convinced that it was going to connect at any time. So they didn't even bother naming this cave. They were just convinced it was part of Fern Cave. And so they just called it, kind of referred to it as Fern. Eventually, when it wasn't connecting, they decided they needed to go ahead and name it to get it on the cave survey, and they named it New Fern. So this section, New Fern, is very complicated. It has 3 major levels with several sublevels within each one of those. The upper level that they first explored were a lot of big canyons, very heavily decorated rooms, and lots of pits. Almost anywhere you looked, there's a pit in the floor. This is one of the most heavily traveled pits. I showed this picture earlier with the ladder. This is the blowing hole, which is a small 30-foot pit that leads to a lot of the rest of the cave. And they actually left this cable ladder permanently rigged while they were doing a lot of the exploration. And this picture is actually what the bottom of that small pit looks like. And they found lots of just really beautiful formation areas all over the section of the cave, very heavily decorated. This is a room called Helictide Heaven, which is one of the most famous formation rooms in TAG. It has some of the craziest looking formations I have ever seen anywhere. These formations, a lot of people who are open water divers say they look like coral reefs, and they just grow in all different directions. There doesn't seem to be any reason for how they are formed. And remember this picture, here's a fellow here again. They discovered if you went in the Johnston entrance, they named the entrance to New Fern after Jim Johnston, the guy who found it. They discovered that if you just went right in the entrance, stayed at the very highest level and just went down that passage, after about a half mile, they would pop out in the morgue sinkhole. So that was the first connection they made sort of in between these caves. And like I said, there are just pits everywhere. So eventually they explored enough of these pits that they found the middle section of the cave. And the middle section is just a series of really huge rooms. There's lots of breakdown, not much water, not much formations, but just very impressive rooms. You can see a person there for scale. And the last room they found was the largest room in the cave. This is the west room, and there's 2 people in this photo for scale. And after they explored this room, they went down into the bottom and found one more pit that led to a really confusing breakdown section that led to the lowest level of the cave. And the lowest level is called the bottom cave, and it's a large, kind of typical stream passage looking cave, sort of like Limb Rock or something like that. It has a really beautiful stream, a lot of formations in it. So after they'd found all these different sections of the cave, their main goal was like trying to connect them all. They were just convinced it was one cave, and they spent a lot of time trying to make connections. And it wasn't too difficult to connect the morgue, the Little Morgue, and New Fern, because those sort of naturally connected to each other. But they could not find the connection to Surprise Pit. And they knew it had to, because all the other sections of the cave that they had discovered and mapped sort of wrapped around Surprise. So they knew there had to be connection somewhere. So finally, some people were poking around in the bottom section of Fern in the bottom cave, and they found some really, really low, really nasty crawls that were trending directly towards Surprise. And they were pretty sure it connected. So they arranged this big trip. They sent one team in the morgue entrance down into the bottom cave, and they sent another team into Surprise down to the bottom of the pit. And the people in the pit took whistles and kind of blew, made a lot of noise so the people in the other section of the cave could hear them. And eventually, after a really long, grueling, horrible sounding trip, they did make the connection. And there were two people, Dick Graham and Sherry Graham, who actually crawled from the bottom cave in Fern to Surprise and then climbed out Surprise Pit. And that's one of only two groups of people I know in the entire history of the cave who have ever done that trip because it is so horrible. And finally, there was one more connection that was made. There's one little tiny cave down near the Paint Rock River. This is the entrance to the cave. Usually this whole area here is full of water. But if you manage to get into the cave and go through some really nasty crawly stuff, you get into a pretty nice stream passage. And it goes for about 1,000 feet, and then it pinches down and it's completely sumped. So after they mapped it, they could see that it looked like it was probably going to connect to a very specific place in the bottom cave of Fern. So they recruited a couple of cave divers to do this dive. Oh, I should mention too, these are our friends Jason and Chrissy Richards. Some of you probably know them. They just recently moved to Chattanooga. This is not a picture from the 70s. They're not that old. Jason and Chrissy actually went and did a really accurate map of the sump for us in, I guess, the mid 2000s. But this is just the best picture I have of the entrance. So for that cave diving connection, that very first time in 1978, a couple of guys dove through the sump, and then J.B. Van Swearingen, some other cavers, went from the morgue entrance down to the bottom cave to the area where they were pretty sure that the cave divers would come out, and they all met. And it turns out one of the cave divers actually brought in a small bottle of champagne and 2 glasses, and they all toasted the connection. And so this has always been called the Champagne Connection because of that. And this is a picture of the final map. It's really a work of art. It's a beautiful map. It was never really released to the Alabama Cave Survey, so the only way you can really see it is to ask Bill Turow to show it to you, and he will. And it's just spectacular. And one thing to note too is even though this was mapped in the 1960s and survey techniques were nothing like we use today, and they were just using small handheld compasses to get their readings, and they weren't using any kind of vertical inclination or anything like that. It's an incredibly accurate map. Years later, when people would study the map and try to find connections between different parts of the cave, they would look and see, oh, these 2 passages are very close together, but they don't really touch. A lot of those could be dug open and they connected perfectly. So it's actually a very, very accurate map. Okay, the next big thing to happen in the cave was the discovery of a population of gray bats. Gray bats are a special kind of bat because they roost in huge colonies, like thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of bats, just lots and lots of bats. And unfortunately, they're extremely sensitive to disturbance. So most of us have never seen gray bats because most of the big bat caves where they live have been protected for a long time. They're either gated or somehow access is restricted. So, I had never seen a gray bat before I started working on some projects with bat biologists in this cave. And one of the odd things about their biology is they like really, really cold caves, which is unusual. Here in Tag, all of our caves are about 56 degrees or whatever. But the odd thing about the morgue area of Fern Cave is it's a cold trap. And in the winter, cold air will funnel down into that part of the cave and it will just hold it. And the first time I went on a bat trip in there, it was like in the upper 30s, low 40s, and I froze to death. Nobody told me it was going to be that cold. So that's kind of unusual. Gray bats usually hibernate for a really long period of time. And just for those of you who might be new to this, the place where bats hibernate in the winter is called a hibernaculum. So anyway, back in the early 70s, Jim Johnston was in the morgue. They, finally decided to map it to see if it connected to the rest of the Fern Cave. And they found a bat with a band on its wing. And they'd been helping some researchers, so they knew it was important to record that information. So they wrote down the bat information or the band information and sent it off to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And about a week later, they got a call from a very excited young scientist named Merlin Tuttle. And this is a photo of Merlin from the 70s. If you don't know who Merlin Tuttle is, you might have heard of an organization called Bat Conservation International. He founded that organization to protect bats worldwide. However, at the time, he was a college student and he was finishing up his dissertation on the ecology of gray bats. So what he was doing is he was going all over the country, trapping gray bats, banding them, and trying to figure out where they went at different times of the year. And Merlin was actually missing like half his bats. He didn't know where they went in the wintertime. And when he got this information about the bat band, he thought, I bet this is where a lot of my bats are. So he came down and went in the cave, and sure enough, here are some photos from the 70s of them doing some bat inventories. He found a whole lot of bats. So here's some more recent pictures to give you an idea of just how many bats are in this cave. This is Steve and me on one of the bat inventory trips in the early 2000s. And I mean, it's hard to describe what it's like being in the cave with that many bats, because when you look at the walls, it just looks like brown velvet. And, you're creeping around trying not to make any noise at all because they'll all wake up. But the bat wings sort of are moving. And it is just, it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life to be in a cave with this many bats. And when Merlin was done doing his inventory back then, he estimated that there are 1.5 million gray bats that live in Fern Cave every winter. And here's a close-up of them. They're super cute. They have cute little faces. I just love them. So because after Merlin discovered that this part of the cave was this huge bat hibernaculum, he convinced the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to buy the cave to protect the bats. So they bought 4 of the entrances. The woman who owned Surprise Pit sort of held out and wouldn't let them buy her property. So that stayed in private hands, luckily for cavers, because the SCCI eventually bought it. But when the Fish and Wildlife Service purchased the cave, the Huntsville Grotto kind of started collaborating with them, and they created a volunteer position called the Fern Cave Access Coordinator. And this is a person this is J.V. Van Swearingen again. He was the first access coordinator. Steve Pitts my husband is now the current cave access coordinator. But it was this person's job to sort of work with cavers who wanted to go to the cave. We were really lucky that when the Fish and Wildlife bought it, they didn't just close it. They said, people can still go to the parts of the cave with no bats, just don't go into the morgue when the bats are there. So that is how access worked for many years. If a caver wanted to go to the Johnston entrance and just look around, you could just contact JV or Steve and say, hey, I want a permit. There were very specific rules you had to follow, but it was fairly easy to get access if you were a member of the NSS and a grotto and knew what you were doing. In addition to the bats, there were some other rare plants and animals on the property. The hart's tongue fern used to grow in the morgue sinkhole. It was, deep and protected. And so these ferns really thrived there. Unfortunately, they are all now gone. And Alan Kressler told me that he thinks they were all poached. He thinks plant collectors went and dug them all up. So there are no ferns there anymore. Just recently, a scientist actually in Huntsville discovered an Alabama cave shrimp in that lower stream section of fern, which is kind of exciting. And there's all kinds of crazy, interesting animals. This is not a picture of a pseudoscorpion from fern, but I just wanted to show you this picture because it gives you a good sense of scale. It's just a really interesting little animal, and there's all kinds of small creatures like this that are unique to fern. Another thing about Fern that I mentioned, it has some really interesting archaeology and paleontology. And this is a photo of an extinct red wolf. And they found this skeleton when they were doing the cave survey in the early 70s. The bottom section of Fern actually has a lot of interesting animal remains. There are bare bones that are just kind of sitting around down there. There are some boulders that have really big claw marks in the mud. And these are from what is called a giant short-faced bear. And you can see how big it is. Everybody knows grizzly bears are huge. Polar bears are even bigger, but the short-faced bear was the largest bear to ever live. And there's lots of evidence that this bear was using the lower section of Fern. And this is just a photo of the early surveyors looking at the red wolf skeleton. There's also a section in the bottom cave where there are some like torches, or they're reeds that grow next to the river, and the tops of them are burnt. So everybody's always assumed that they're torches that people carried into the cave to explore it. Of course, there's zero evidence to support this, but makes sense to me. So we always call them the reed torches. As far as I know, these have not been carbon dated. It would be really interesting to do that. Then back in the 90s, Steve found what looked like a kind of interesting pit in the very upper level of the cave. So a couple of us decided to go and check it out, see if there's anything down there. And when we got down into the pit, we found one big ledge. And when we started looking, it was just covered in bones. Like all these things that look like rocks, they were bones. And this is a friend of mine holding a Pleistocene horse tooth. This tooth is probably 13,000 years old. And these are from extinct horses that were native to North America before Europeans brought horses over. We also found a human jawbone in there, which was pretty crazy. And we got permission to date some of these bones. The human bone was 2,400 years old. The sloth bone was 12,000 years old. And there was an armadillo plate or scoot that was 11,000 years old. The McWane Center in Birmingham, Alabama now has all the bones that were removed, and they're conserving them. And this is a giant ground sloth that is actually the size of the sloth whose toe bone we found. I think that's really cool. We think that this was probably a open air pit at some point, and maybe it was an animal den, and the animal was like dragging, whatever it caught into its den, and it washed into the cave. We don't know, because there were a huge variety of animal skeletons in there, or animal bones. There's also lots of places in the cave that these are called stoke marks, these little black marks. And this is what happens when somebody has like a bundle of the reeds. They're sort of like bamboo that you can see growing along rivers. There's a lot of evidence that ancient people used those for torches back, hundreds, thousands of years ago. And what would happen is they would get this bundle of reeds and light them on fire. And then as they were going through the cave, just like as a cigarette burns down, you'd get a bunch of ash on the end. When that happened, they'd sort of tap the edges of those reeds against the wall to knock the ashes off. And these are the marks that are left. Now, these marks are in the upper level of the cave that would have been really easy to access, and they are just everywhere. There's some parts of the walls that are almost solid black because there's so many stoke marks. The interesting thing is we found stoke marks down at the bottom of 100-foot pits that no matter how much the geology of the cave has changed over the last couple thousand years, there is still no way that somebody could get down to that area without using a rope. So it's really fascinating to think of how did those stoke marks get down in these really remote areas at the bottom of pits. It's pretty cool. We also found this big blob of fur in one of the upper levels of the passage. It's not an animal. There's no bones in it. We sent a sample off to a lab. They didn't know what it was. couple archaeologists we took into the cave think it might have been like a fur bag or something like that people were using for some purpose. Who knows? It's a big mystery. It's really weird. A lot of people who have seen it said they've never seen anything like this, so it's very unusual. Also, back in the early 90s, the Huntsville Grotto decided that we wanted to remap the cave. I showed you a picture of the original map that was very accurate, but it didn't have any vertical detail. If you just looked at that map, it's almost impossible to tell where everything is or what level it is. So the Grotto started a new mapping project, and it was very, very accurate. I wasn't really involved in the origins of this, but they decided to use these tripod mounted instruments, and they used the tripod mounted through all the major sections of the cave to get incredibly accurate, what they called a backbone survey. And then they used, just regular survey gear to complete the rest of the mapping project. And we had a good bit of participation. A lot of people from the Dogwood City Grotto participated. We had people from all over the country that came down to help with this. It was a lot of fun. We mapped about 10 miles of the cave. And Steve has drafted some of it, and the results are just fabulous. For any of those of you who have been to Helictide Heaven, I think this blue passage here is Helictide Heaven. And you can just see how complicated that section of the cave is. It's really neat to see the drafted version and see how the layers are all related to each other. Unfortunately, the next thing we're going to talk about, the white nose syndrome era, when that started, all the survey work had to stop. So the project has not been completed. And that's the next big thing that happened with the history of the cave. In 2009, for those of you who are a little bit newer, white nose syndrome is a disease, a fungal disease that affects bats, and it is hugely devastating. It started in 2006 or 7. I can't remember exactly what year it started. It started out in the northeastern US, and it just sort of kind of crept south, and it killed almost all the bats of certain species as it went. Luckily, the gray bats seem completely immune to it. It has not had any effect whatsoever on the gray bats in Fern, but the Fish and Wildlife Service closed the cave anyway, just to be sure. At that time, we had no idea if it would affect the gray bats or not. So 2009, the cave was closed completely, and nobody was allowed to go in the cave, and we were actually not allowed to go on the property for about 6 months or so. Then in 2011, this is like cave had been closed for 2.5 years. Fish and Wildlife contacted us and said, hey, this biologist has this project. They want to get a guano core sample. Will you go do it? So Steve and I went into the cave. This is actually I think it was a 6-foot long tube, and he kind of crammed it down in the guano and pulled out the core. And it was actually a really fascinating project because the guano at the very bottom of this core, which actually is not the bottom of the guano pile because it didn't reach the bottom, that guano was 6,000 years old, and some charcoal samples were 2,700 years old. So it was a really great project. However, as we were on our way to go get the core sample, we saw all kinds of new graffiti in the cave that had happened while the cave was closed. So, there were new arrows. People had carved their name in the banks of the passages and stuff like that. So, to say we were angry about this is an understatement because we had been warning them that just, leaving a cave closed with no oversight. I mean, none of the entrances are gated. They're just open to whoever wants to go in there. We had been warning them that would lead to bad results, and it did. Luckily, Fish and Wildlife they were worried about this, so they gave us a new, very limited permit to go in and clean up some of the graffiti in 2011, and we started working on that. And we also started working on getting access back. Now, they mentioned that I've written a book about the cave, and I had been toying with the idea of doing this for years, but I had never published it because I was worried that if I wrote a book about it, more people would get interested in the cave, they would go to the cave, and it would get vandalized. Well, what happened was, the cave got vandalized with no publicity or anything like that. So when all this was going on with White Nose, that's when I decided to go ahead and publish this book. And I had a couple reasons for doing it when I did. Of course, I mentioned I'm a huge history nerd. I wanted all these stories preserved, but I also wanted to make sure that fish and wildlife biologists and biologists at other agencies knew how devoted cavers are to exploring caves, discovering caves, being involved in cave science, conserving caves, protecting bats, all that kind of stuff. Because woven into my book is stories about everything cavers do to protect caves. And it's not just Fern Cave, it's like all caves that we're involved in. And so I thought it was pretty important to kind of get that story out there and make sure that people really understand how important protecting caves is to us. So that's why I decided to write the book. If you go to TAG this weekend, I'm not sure if Emily from Speleo Books is going to be there. They've had a really rough year because of COVID. And I know she has a couple of these books. If you're interested, give them some love and maybe buy some stuff from them. I think the NSS bookstore also has a copy if you're interested.
Emily won't be there. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, okay. I think the NSS office has them. So just to wrap up, this is just the current status of the cave. The SCCI bought Surprise Pit in 2008. So luckily that area is, pretty much same rules as any other SCCI cave. You just have to request a permit and make sure to follow the guidelines of your permit. Access to the rest of the cave is better now. Cavers can go there, but it took us years to get to the point that cavers can visit again. The access rules are a lot more restricted than they used to be. You still have to get a permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service, but now you have to go with an approved team leader, which Steve is one, Mark Jones in your grotto is one, there are a couple others. So yeah, you can't really just go on your own anymore, but it's still fairly easy to go on a trip if you have the interest in doing that. And just to make sure everybody is aware, the bat section of the cave in the morgue is completely closed from August to April every year to protect the bats. So that's kind of the end of my presentation, and happy to take any questions y'all have.
Nicely done.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that was wonderful, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Wow. I had no idea. This is what an extraordinary place and what an extraordinary presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I agree.
Yeah, I think I told Joe, it's been so long since I've given a presentation. I actually had to go and refer to my own book because I was like, I was looking at my presentation. I was like, I don't know what I was supposed to say on this. I had to go look it up. It was pretty crazy.
So Jennifer, are you starting the surveying back again, or?
No, the access is still so restricted. I think it would be really difficult to do that because they don't really like a lot of people going. And I think it's restricted to one trip a weekend of 6 or 8 people. And, we used to have giant survey weekends where we have like 5 or 6 teams, 30 people in there at the same time. So maybe at some point, I'm hoping that maybe one day things will get ramped back up because it'd be really great to finish it.
Well, I highly recommend you guys, if you've not been to Fern, you get Steve to take you I don't know, it's several, is it 300 or 400 feet you go down without really getting on rope from the Johnston entrance. Anyway, it was a fabulous trip and he loves to do it and it's a lot of fun and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can get to in the entrance area without having to do any rope work. And that's some of the most beautiful sections of the cave, actually. So yeah, Holly used to go with us a lot.
That's cool. It's even higher on my list now. Speaking of, Jennifer, how's your knee feeling?
So my knee is better, and now I hurt my shoulder. So
No.
I think we're gonna go. I haven't been to Fern in a long time. I think we're gonna go maybe this weekend. I'm just gonna see how it goes. So,
Will
but
you
yeah,
be at the cave-in?
I will not be at the cave-in.
Do they still make the little mud sculptures that were so cute while you're waiting at the top?
No, that never happened in Fern. That was another cave. I know which one you're talking about,
Right.
but yeah.
I saw them at the top of Fern while we were waiting for our turn to drop the pit. And we used to either look, I'd never made any sculptures, but other people did.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing any when I started going there, but
Yeah.
Or sculptures when I went at the top of Surprise.
Yeah.
There were or were not, Alex?
There were.
Yeah.
Really?
Alex, those sketchy crawls sound like they would be right up your alley.
Yeah, we were joking that when she was talking about that horrible through crawl to the bottom of Surprise, that would be your next adventure.
Honestly, I mean, like the bottom cave sounds cool. Like, I mean, what about doing Surprise Pit and then go and do that crawl and check it out?
All right. Well, count us in. We're down for it. Andy says he's especially excited.
15-hour trip.
I'll bring snacks.
Any other questions for Jennifer?
No, thank you very much, Jennifer. That was very interesting.
you're
Thank you.
welcome.
Such
Yes,
a
thank
privilege to
you.
have you tonight.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but that was wonderful.
Thanks.
Jennifer,
Yeah,
thank
can't wait
you
to read the book.
for the presentation. It was fantastic. And I reached out to you during this summer to ask you to present. I got here late, but I did catch
Oh.
it. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hi, Anna.
All right. Well, with no more questions, we'll move on with the rest of the meeting. Shouldn't be too much longer now. Bragging time. Who went caving?
We haven't been. Yeah, we've been on vacation, so we haven't really gone caving.
Trying to remember.
I went to a corn maze, so that was like above ground caving.
That doesn't count. That doesn't count.
It counts.
Okay. All right.
I mean, I've been on a couple cave digs, but I'm not really allowed to talk about it yet. But I can say that is the most difficult work I have ever been involved with. I mean, there's not enough ibuprofen to cure that, but I can't get enough.
Matt, yeah, you came on.
Matt,
Hi, I just got on.
How you doing,
Yeah,
Matt?
I'm doing fine. Sorry, I was sitting here working and just let time fly.
Well, glad you finally got on. That's good.
Yeah. I'm especially sorry I missed talking about Fern. It's been a long time since I've been there.
Oh man, yeah. I'm so excited to go now.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. I went with JV Swearenson several times years ago.
That's cool.
Yeah, he walked us around all over the mountain, up and down, back and forth, so we wouldn't know which way to go to get back to that certain passage. And that was before GPS.
Yeah.
you gonna be at the cave-in?
Oh, you're hurting me. No, we've got to go to this weekend.
Oh no. Well,
Don't say that too loud. Yeah, it's tough. The kids are very
how
upset
fun.
about it. Bad. But it's my brother-in-law, so can't miss that one.
No.
I mean, I could, but no, that wouldn't go over good.
Any other caving stories?
Whitlaw and I, we did our first bolt climb this weekend. So last
Nice.
weekend we topped a 100-foot pit. So
Oh,
it's a new
wow.
100-foot pit and tag right now. Yeah, 11-hour trip for the people that stayed back and hauled the gear.
Well, when is it gonna be when's it gonna be public?
It's someone else's project and we climb the dome for them, so they'll map it, which may not happen for a while. But I'll probably have to go back sometime and just check on the rope, make sure everything's fine. There's nothing that we didn't, completely oversee. So there was no rub when we left it. No rub ever should be. So
Good.
No rope.
I hope the rope's still there.
There's plenty of rope still there.
Did Destiny, did y'all have questions about the cave-in?
I'm trying to think of where to start.
No pressure. You can
Hold on.
got him.
Sorry. Okay. I was trying to think of where to start. Like, can anybody give me just kind of an overview of what it looks like?
Sure. So
Wow.
it runs from Thursday to Sunday, and it's basically like a big camp out. So you would bring your own camping gear, and you do have to pay. I think you have to register for it, and you have to be an NSS member to do that.
That was going to be my question.
Yep. So it's worthwhile to become an NSS member anyway, if you think you're going to be into caving. And even if you decide not to be, it's a good donation. I think it's like $30 a year or something like that. But yeah, there's going to be tons of lead caving trips, 2 huge bonfires, one on Friday night and one on Saturday night, the biggest one on Saturday night. And people from all over the country, and maybe sometimes even from all over the world, come like cavers to just be with each other and hang out. So I think it's a really good introduction to the community.
That sounds really amazing. I don't know if we'd have time to throw it together before this weekend. Can y'all tell me I'm sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions. Can y'all tell me what kind of a cleanup looks like if we were to come to one of those?
Anna, she might have more info on that. But it's definitely like people look on you very favorably if you participate in, giving back to the community for sure.
Which cleanup are you talking about? Or just in general?
In general, and I probably would have known if you didn't ask me. I'm very
It was the upcoming NSS work weekend, I believe in November.
Yes.
Okay. So usually we go up to the NSS headquarters up in Huntsville, and Marine Handler, who is the NSS operations vice president, she usually has a million tasks for us, but usually she chooses one big task, and we usually tackle that on Saturday. This next week, they'll be having a bunch of trees dropped at the park, and what we'll need to do is just bring chainsaws and cut wood and clear the brush and everything. Camping is available Friday and Saturday night. And then Sunday, I usually lead a trip, horizontal or vertical, depending on who's interested and what their skills are. But that's just the NSS weekend, the work weekend. Not a cleanup. I guess I haven't had a cleanup yet, so that's a little bit different. But the work weekend, we just work Saturday and cave Sunday and just camp.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Do you have any questions? I think that's all we have for now. Thank you guys for letting us be a part of it, though. I've really enjoyed this meeting.
Welcome.
Isn't there a cleanup coming up in Patty John's Cave sometime in the near future?
Yeah.
Alex?
There is. I'm pretty sure it's put together by Alan Paget or the Lafayette Grotto. What are they called? Pigeon Mountain Grotto. I'll see if I can pull up exactly what that is. But that's also a great way to meet people. I'd recommend going. I don't think I'll go, but here it is. It is November 6th at 9 a.m. Alan Paget. There's a page on his Facebook page, and so he posted it in there and a few other places. But they'll have trash bags, graffiti removal, and you don't actually have to get a permit for that day. So if you go for the cleanup, you don't need to worry about getting a fishing license like you typically would. So.
Can I ask
That
a
is-
random question?
Sure.
How do you remove graffiti from a cave without like damaging the cave? You know what I'm saying? That's a stupid question.
In Petty John's is a different cave. It's one of my favorite, and there's a lot of mud. So when I'm going to the cave, I just like grab some mud and I slop it on the spray paint, and that's my favorite way of doing it. Some people, I've done one other one, and we had brushes and water, and so we would spray the spray paint with water or something, and we just brushed it, use a lot of elbow grease. So we do like to look at the graffiti and see if it's historic, because apparently that matters. But if there is some caves where they've done graffiti removals and had found Native American writings in there, and so those have been protected and even gated because they were so important. So that's another thing to watch out for during cleanups.
Thank you.
I have a question. So I was wondering so I see that there's a beginner horizontal through trip. Would that be like a good first caving experience?
Where?
Let's see. Sinking Cove Cave.
Yes, you should 100% go to that. I think it's cool though.
Okay, yeah, I saw that it's like I could join the wait list.
Yeah, join the wait list. Yes, for sure. Anna's leading that, and it's a wonderful cave. You would love it.
And I don't see anything about cost. Does it do we have to? It's just free.
Free.
Okay, that's pretty cool. And then also I see that there's the list of required items, which is very helpful. But I was just kind of wondering if anyone had any kind of brands that they recommended, because I don't want to just spend a lot of money on something that a basic one is sufficient, just because I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
So I guess not for everything, but as far as where it says sturdy boots, is that just hiking boots? And then the caving helmet, what are good brands for that? What kind of light sources are people using? Just that kind of stuff.
Really good questions there.
The cave-in will have vendors, that you can look at the different gear. You're not coming to the cave-in door.
I could, but I can't. I have 3 tests right around that time. I'm in college, so I'm gonna make it.
Ruby, so some things matter more than others, and if you're just getting started, you can kind of not necessarily get high-end stuff, because you want to be sure that you're going to stick with it before you sink a lot of money into it. So boots, just something really grippy. It doesn't matter. You don't have to go really expensive. Just good tread, good ankle support. Helmets and lighting might be a little bit more specific, but there's a website called On Rope One, and there's a guy that runs it named William. And if you give him a call, he will talk your ear off about any sort of caving gear that you could imagine, and he's a delight. So I would say start there.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
And the grotto does rent helmets and lights for people.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're just going to try a trip, it's probably a good way to just get a helmet and light.
Yes. And actually, where do you live, Ruby?
I live in Atlanta.
Okay, so do I. And I have a bucket of old helmets that I will just give you one if you want to come check them out. They're old, but you know what I mean? They'll protect your noggin in a cave. So you're welcome to one of those if you want it.
That'd be awesome. Thank you. How can I get in touch with you?
Do you have a pen?
Yeah.
No, obviously, right. Him 863 602 0869.
Thank
And
you
you can
so
just
much.
text. You're welcome.
Okay. And then I have one more question. Do people like ever carpool to these ones that are especially like in Alabama or Tennessee?
Sometimes, but a lot of times people have their whole cars filled with camping gear and stuff like that. Do you have a car?
I'm about to get a new car. Yeah, my car, it definitely exceeded the mileage. But I'm like getting a new car soon. I just don't know if I'll have one by October 23rd, if I even make it off of the wait list. So I was just curious.
Okay. Well, I can text more about that with you and see if we can figure something out. I don't know who else going to that. So
Okay, thanks so much.
you're welcome.
All right. Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
Just a comment. I'm just a regular member, but these are all great questions. This is the kind of questions that I love to hear, and it's great having new members. I just wanted to chime in and say that.
Thank you, Josh.
Anna, you could ask Riley if he's going to crawl up that mast on the Friday night fire to put the flag up.
What flag?
Paul's got a flag that's got to go up on the big mast. So Riley said that he would love to shimmy up that to put that flag up there. I just wanted to make sure he was still on that page.
Well, I will convince him of it. If not, or I will else.
I'll rock, scissors, paper him if we have to.
All right. What else do we have? Going once. Going
Joe, this
twice.
is that presentation recorded. Did I see it right? That was recorded.
All of the presentation was recorded, and most of the meeting was recorded. I missed the first 15 minutes. I simply forgot to hit the record button, but we have the presentation, and I see Destiny's hand up.
Okay.
I think we have one more question. So we were looking at the calendar and we noticed that there was only like one cave trip for all of 2021. Is there that you can see for now? So is there
like for the
more?
rest of 2021?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to get people to lead caving trips. But yes, there will probably be a couple more before the year is out that are official. The best way is to really get to know people and come to meetings and events and stuff like this. And that way you can get invited on trips.
Campouts especially, because on Sunday of campouts, a lot of people go caving, and those are a lot of unofficial trips. So
yes, for sure. Campouts, Alex is right.
What other questions do we have?
I have a question for the new members. Do you guys know about the emergency type stuff that you need to, and the proper clothing that you need to wear while you're caving?
Extensive amount of research before we did Stevens Gap. So my husband's extremely really just loves researching things. So really a good planner. He's really good at that.
I know that I know the types of materials of clothing that are ideal, and about the kind of temperature that it will be in the cave. But as far as safety stuff, would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Well, others will, go ahead and chime in, but you should never cave alone. You should always have people with you. You should have 3 sources of light plus a backup batteries for those lights, an extra t-shirt, A trash bag and candles do wonders. Proper shoes, no tennis shoes, no boots.
As far as footwear is concerned, I'd like to weigh in there. Generally, you want boots that cover your ankles. I also personally prefer steel toe. Some people are for that. Some people are against it. Forget the waterproof nonsense. You're not nothing. There's no such thing as waterproof in a cave, but good sturdy boots that cover your ankles.
Don't do like I did and bring a peanut butter sandwich and stick it in your pocket. It'll just be mush. I didn't know.
I like the Energy Goose too, the stuff that's easy to pack, that contains a lot of good caloric value plus some caffeine. Always helps me. I like bringing an extra pair of caving gloves. So if one gets just completely soaking wet, sometimes one of the second pair of dry gloves has helped me a little bit. One thing that you should be aware of if you're going to be in any seriously wet caves is sometimes some sort of neoprene is suggested. I'm good at cold and I'm good at wet, but wet and cold is tough, and it's hard to get warm after you get cold. So a little first aid kit, a couple Band-Aids, a little bit of duct tape, a little bit of electrical tape can go a long ways. I like taking a bigger Nalgene container and shoving extra stuff into those. They have a tendency to be slightly more waterproof, so you can try to keep some stuff dry. And obviously you have to have some sort of hydration.
Synthetics are recommended. Cotton is ill-advised. Cotton keeps the moisture close to your skin. It'll freeze you.
A really lightweight rain jacket can do wonders as far as insulating you and giving you that little bit of extra. Plus, if you got any serious air movement in certain parts of the cave, that'll be one of the fastest way to get fucking cold quick, and that will help.
Also, make sure somebody knows where you're going, what time you expect to be out, and when you do get out, let them know you're out. And hopefully that person also knows who they should contact should you not make it out on time.
That's what we're referring to when we ask about a call out. Do you have a call out? Does somebody know where you're going and when you're getting out?
So we did our call out, but I didn't account for the time difference between Huntsville and Atlanta. So we told our person like an hour difference between. Messed up there. I gotta remember that next time.
Typically, we just keep it on Eastern.
You think that anyone that's heard about like the Aaron Ralston story would like know to do a call out so they're not like the next 127 hours? You'd think.
That's a good point.
All right, what else do we have? Okay, Mr. Secretary, the chair motions to adjourn. Are there any objections? My fellow cavers, the meeting is adjourned. Glad to see everyone. Let's go caving soon. Cave-in's coming up.
Bye, Joe. See you there.
See you, Joe.
Good night,
Y'all
everybody.
Bye, guys. Nice to meet you guys.
Yes. It was.
Dane, you don't want to cartography Paleo City?